If you can state your name and a little bit about what you do, where you're from.
Absolutely. So my name is Dalton Higgins, and I'm a global music promoter. So I've promoted some 500 plus concerts in Toronto, Canada. I've also written 6 books, mostly revolving around hip-hop culture. One is a bestseller. It's called Hip Hop World, and what it is I sort of make the case that hip-hop has now grown up and left the hood, and it has now traveled across 7 continents. So what that means is when we look at traditional hip-hop culture, people used to look at New York, LA, down south, Atlanta, but now we're talking the continent of Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, the Middle East, Europe. It's just, it's racking up a lot of air miles, is what I like to say about hip-hop. It's racking up a ton of air miles, you know?
In the context of human rights, what role do you think hip-hop has begun to play?
Yeah, now, depending on what culture you come from, hip-hop, it actually, let's say you take a place like Cuba, hip-hop, hip-hop and human rights are inextricably linked, okay? When you look at places like Cuba, for example, when they have this fantastic hip-hop festival, when you're rapping about things that have nothing to do with human rights in Cuba, you are frowned upon. It's almost like the opposite of what's going on in the West, okay? So go to Cuba, create rhymes that are about materialism, that are sexist, that aren't talking about, that are not issues oriented, not talking about race, sex, class. You'll get frowned upon in that society, okay? In the West now, you get lionized and celebrated when you're rapping about things that have nothing to do with human rights. Now, I look at rap music as a part of the broader hip-hop culture as being it's protest music, you know? So at its core, it's music, it's a speak-out mechanism for disenfranchised communities, okay? So these are the roots. I actually happen to be, I'm of Jamaican descent, and when we look at the roots of, hip-hop coming from Jamaica, Kool Herc, bringing that over to the South Bronx. In Jamaica, you have a music form called toasting, okay? Just like how you have a toaster toasting. And what toasting was really, it was like the West African griot. It's a storyteller who's talking about things happening in the community, talking about issues. It's very issues-oriented, called toasting. Rap music is a part of hip-hop culture, just an extension of that, of Jamaican toasting, okay? Of the West African griot. Now, for one, in fact today we're talking about some rappers just rapping for, art for art's sake. Rapping just to make good art. Now, I don't know if that's, at all possible when we're talking about rap music. So when we look at a lot of the most integral, historical works of hip-hop in the canon, hip-hop Canada, from Grandmaster Flash to Nas to whomever, Tupac, Shakur, KRS, one that goes on and on, a lot of their anthems, songs that are considered anthems, they're songs that are saying something, So rap music is always about saying something, If you're not saying so much something, your songs aren't going to become a part of any canon. They're not going to get documented in books like, and now we're developing these sort of, hip-hop encyclopedias, hip-hop dictionaries, people are starting to now to track, rap music's greatest songs of all time, whether it's Rolling Stone, whether it's a Source Double XL, and you'll notice that most of the songs most of the songs as part of the hip-hop canon are carrying some sort of strong message that ties or attaches itself to some form of human rights, right? People of color, racialized communities, uplifting women, women's empowerment, environmental issues, race, talking about, or I like to say in Jamaica, we like to say talking about isms and schisms. That's what a lot of the best rap music does, is talking about isms and schisms, racism, sexism, right, classism, right, isms and schisms. That's what the best rap music is doing. It's definitely attached to human rights, right, yeah. I don't know if I was getting too loud there.
No, that's great. What way do you think that music can be used as a tool to elevate consciousness?
Yeah, music, in fact, when we talk about using different vehicles to elevate the consciousness of humanity, I think, in fact, music is the best way to do that, because one thing about music, Bob Marley said, one thing about reggae music, when it hits you, you feel no pain. Music is the one form of culture that cuts across any race, class, gender, sexuality distinctions. Okay, and when we talk about, in my third book, Hip Hop World, hip hop has done this thing that it sort of acts like the United Nations. It's sort of gathered people from across cultures, religious distinctions, class distinctions, and has them essentially saying the one thing. It's one voice. So music, I can sit up here and preach to you. I work in education as well, so I can be like a professor and educator and speak to students by the thousands, or I can bring in an MC, and communicate some of those same ideas, and it's going to have a lot more sway. All right, so let's say somebody like Jay-Z were to say, treat women with some kind of kindness and dignity, and treat women like queens. That's going to carry a lot more weight than it is if I were to preach or lecture and say essentially the same thing. That's the power of music. So if you take some icon, it could even be Migos. A lot of people like him, and imagine if he were to say something that had something to do with raising awareness around poverty situations in the continent, Africa, in Latin America. Imagine how revolutionary that would be. That would literally change lives, versus me preaching or having some sort of older, out of touch, Caucasian guy, flown into developing world to talk about poverty and humanity, right? So that's my belief. Trying to stay coherent, because
it's great. It's great. Do you think that the way that hip-hop is used, or should be used as a tool to create change, differs from how the approach that we would use in the first world versus the third world?
Okay. So hip-hop, the question is hip-hop...
If we're using hip-hop as a tool to create tangible change, do you think that approach should or does differ between the first and the third world?
Okay. Yes, it does differ greatly. I think because we live in a raging, it's like a hyper-capitalist society. When we talk about the West, which is what I'm familiar with, having lived, born in the West, I would say that it's almost like a privilege to look at, or let me put it this way. To use hip-hop, let's say, I work with an artist, Emmanuel Jal. He's South Sudanese, and we always talk about, it's almost a privilege to not be talking about human rights and talking about when you come from a sort of a poverty-affected region or a war-torn region. So it's almost a privilege to not, to just talk about the accumulation of wealth and buying fast cars, jewelry, scoring as many hot women as you think if you're a heterosexual male. So to be doing that, that's almost like a privilege when you grow up in the developing world, what you're referring to as the third world. To not be talking about more pressing issues, which may be just sustenance, food, shelter, clothing. This is your day-to-day concern, if you're growing up in the developing world. Whereas in the so-called first world, in the West where I grew up, it's maybe people feel a sense of more freedom to not so much address hard issues, to not address timely topical issues, because it's so driven by capitalism, the accumulation of wealth. How fast is your car? How many girlfriends, boyfriends do you have? What type of jewelry did you just buy from Jacob the Jeweler in New York? So I think we look at it from a different point of view based on where you're coming from, for sure.
Do you think that Western artists, particularly hip-hop artists, are aware of any of the struggles that are going on outside their borders or in their own house?
I would say that the vast majority of rappers that I've run into, and I've been doing this for a long time in the United States, I don't think a lot of them maybe so much have an opportunity to go outside their block to see how people are being affected by things like poverty, issues around gender, in the developing countries. I don't see it. I would say that I live in Toronto, Canada, and Toronto is arguably the most multicultural city on the planet. So there seems to be a more elevated sense of awareness in a place like Toronto. So you have most people in Toronto, Canada, that are hip hop practitioners. They're refugees, they're immigrants, you know. There's a rapper named Kanan from Somalia. You have a lot of rappers in Toronto that are doing, you know, world-renowned rappers like Emmanuel Jal, based in Toronto. They are former, you know, child soldiers, you know. They are people who fled persecution, left in exile, and ended up in Toronto. So in a place like Toronto, there is a large awareness of what's the issues that are impacting the developing countries, you know, when it comes to human rights. In the United States, I would say not so much, you know.
What do you think the potential is of hip-hop as a tool for social change?
I think hip-hop has sort of immense potential to bring about social change, and one of the examples I like to give is I went out to Newark, New Jersey, to cover something called the National Hip-Hop Political Convention back in 2004, and I must tell you, it's something, there's just this critical mass, this groundswell of activists from throughout the United States that congregated and end up in New Jersey, and they were able to get almost 5 million young people, you know, from across, you know, different walks of life, multicultural fully, to get out to the polls and vote for Barack Obama, the President of the United States of America. So that, to me, showed me that we can influence politics, you know, if we organize. I'm into the, as far as organizing, voter registration, civic engagement. It can bring about wholesale political change. I witnessed it, I was a part of it, you know, National Hip Hop Political Convention. And you just saw organizers, you know, coming from, you know, some low income, others who were solidly middle class. You know, one of the leaders of the movement, this guy, William Upsky Wimstad, you know, he's Jewish, sort of solidly middle class, all the way down to people who are not doing so well economically, and we all sort of came together and you know, I think helped change the nation, you know, as far as the election of Barack Obama. So it can definitely bring about great wholesale change.